Secrets buried beneath snow and stone have a terrifying way of clawing their way out. In the ruthless royal courts of medieval lichens, a hidden lineage means instant death or eternal captivity. One terrified mother risked everything to conceal her twin sons from the most powerful sovereign of their age. But destiny cannot be chained. When two tiny, ferocious wolves erupted in the middle of a grand royal feast, the entire kingdom gasped, and a king finally recognized his legacy. The year was 1482, and the kingdom of Aylesbury was gripped by a winter so severe it froze the very marrow in the bones of its people. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice that had settled over Beatrice Danvers's heart. Beatrice was not a lady of the court, nor was she a warrior of renown. She was a simple healer's apprentice, a wolf of low birth with a submissive spirit and a quiet life. Yet for one fleeting dangerous summer, she had been the sole obsession of Gareth Lancaster, the crown prince, the undisputed alpha, and the most feared warrior in the 5 northern territories. Their romance had been a tempest of stolen moments in the castle's glass house, of whispered promises under the shadow of the ancient wolf statues, and of a passion that defied the strict, unforgiving laws of their kind. But a prince does not marry a healer. When Gareth's father passed, the burden of the crown fell heavily upon his broad shoulders. The royal council, led by the calculating prime advisor Gregory Halloway, demanded that the new king secure his borders through a strategic alliance. Gareth was to be betrothed to a pure-blood princess from a neighboring territory. Beatrice, knowing the lethal politics of the court, understood that she was nothing more than a loose end. If the council discovered her affair with the king, she would be quietly disposed of to prevent any scandal or threat to the royal marriage. Then came the morning the scent of pine and wild lavender made her violently ill. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was with child. In lichen society, an illegitimate royal pup was a death sentence for the mother. The child would be ripped from her arms to be raised as a royal ward, and she would be executed or exiled to the barren wastelands. Beatrice knew Gareth's possessive nature. If he knew, he might burn the kingdom down to keep her, plunging Aylesbury into a civil war it could not survive. Or worse, the council would assassinate her before Gareth even found out. She could not risk it. Under the cover of a moonless night, carrying nothing but a satchel of herbs and the clothes on her back, Beatrice fled. She traveled for days through the biting frost, masking her scent with wolfsbane and crushed mint, until she reached Oakhaven, a remote, forgotten village on the very edge of the kingdom's borders. It was there, in a drafty, abandoned woodcutter's cabin, that Beatrice's true trial began. The pregnancy of an alpha's mate is notoriously brutal. The pups drain the mother's strength, requiring the alpha father's aura to stabilize them. Without Gareth, Beatrice nearly died. When her time finally came, she delivered not one, but 2 squalling boys. She named them Liam and Leo. They were beautiful, perfect, and terrifying. Even as infants, their lineage was undeniable. Liam possessed eyes the color of liquid gold, the exact shade of the Lancaster royal line. Leo inherited Gareth's brooding, stormy blue gaze, sharp and piercing. Raising alpha-blooded twins in a peasant village was an exhausting act of deception. As they grew into toddlers, their strength was unnatural. They could splinter solid oak chairs with a casual grip, and their juvenile growls carried a low, rumbling resonance that made the local village dogs whimper and hide. Beatrice lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. She taught them to keep their heads down, to never look the village elders in the eye, and to suppress the primal dominance that boiled in their blood. "You must be quiet as the mice, my little wolves," she would whisper to them by the hearth, stroking their dark, unruly hair. "If the big wolves find you, they will take you away. You must never show your teeth. You must never let them see your fire." For 5 years, the secret held. Beatrice built a modest life in Oakhaven, serving as the village herbalist. The twins grew into strapping, intelligent 5-year-olds, fiercely protective of their mother and bound by an unbreakable twin connection. They communicated in silent glances and shared an instinctual understanding of the woods around them. But peace, in a medieval world governed by beasts, is always a temporary illusion. In the spring of 1487, disaster struck the Outer Rim. A ruthless faction of rogue lichens, displaced by a territorial war in the east, swept through the borderlands. They pillaged, burned, and slaughtered without mercy. Oakhaven, with its lack of walls and minimal guard, stood no chance. The night the sky turned orange with fire, Beatrice dragged Liam and Leo from their beds. With the screams of her neighbors echoing in the smoke-filled air, she grabbed the twins' hands and ran. They joined a mass exodus of refugees fleeing toward the only stronghold that could withstand the rogue army, Castle Aylesbury. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs as the massive iron portcullis of the royal keep came into view. Returning to the den of the Alpha King was a suicidal gamble, but staying in the open meant certain death for her sons. The castle courtyard was a chaotic sea of mud, blood, and desperate refugees. The king's guards barked orders, funneling the displaced villagers into the lower bailey. Beatrice wrapped thick woolen scarves around the boys' faces, hiding their striking features, and kept her own face smeared with soot and dirt. Because of her medical knowledge, she was immediately conscripted into the castle scullery and infirmary by Mrs. Higgins, the formidable head of the servants. Beatrice and the twins were assigned a tiny, damp alcove behind the kitchens, a cramped space that smelled of old onions and damp stone, but it was safe. Or so she thought. Living in the castle meant navigating a labyrinth of dangers. King Gareth Lancaster had changed in the 5 years since she had fled. The court gossips whispered of his ruthlessness. His arranged betrothal had fallen through when his bride-to-be perished of a sudden fever, leaving him an unmated alpha. Without an anchor, his wolf had grown feral, volatile, and deeply unforgiving. Worse still was Lady Rowena Croft, a high-ranking noblewoman who had set her sights on the empty throne. Rowena was vain, cruel, and fiercely territorial. She prowled the castle corridors like a queen already crowned, terrorizing the staff and keeping a watchful eye on anyone who might displease the king. Beatrice's daily life became a high-wire act. She instructed Liam and Leo to remain hidden in the flower storage room during the day. The rules of survival for the twins: never leave the kitchen quarters. If a guard approaches, look at the floor. Never, under any circumstances, show anger. Do not speak to anyone of royal blood. However, hiding the aura of 2 growing alpha pups was becoming impossible. Even at 5 years old, their presence made the kitchen staff subconsciously deferential. Older servant children naturally submitted to them during illicit games of hide-and-seek. The closest call came 3 weeks into their stay. Beatrice was carrying a heavy basin of bloody water from the training yards when she turned a stone corridor and froze. At the other end of the hall stood King Gareth. He was broader than she remembered, clad in dark leather and chainmail, a heavy fur cloak draped over his broad shoulders. His face was rugged, scarred, and etched with a profound, terrifying weariness. Beside him walked Gregory Halloway, murmuring political strategies that Gareth clearly had no patience for. Beatrice pressed herself against the cold stone wall, bowing her head so low her chin touched her chest, praying to the moon goddess to make her invisible. As Gareth passed, his footsteps suddenly faltered. He stopped. The air in the corridor grew thick and heavy, suffocating under the weight of his alpha aura. Beatrice stopped breathing. Gareth turned his head slightly, his nostrils flaring. He had caught a scent. Beneath the blood, the soot, and the damp wool, a phantom trace of wild lavender and pine lingered in the air. "My king?" Gregory Halloway asked, his voice tight with concern. "Is something amiss?" Gareth's golden eyes swept over the bowed, dirty figure of the servant girl against the wall. His wolf clawed frantically at his chest, howling in a sudden, violent confusion. But Beatrice had heavily doused herself in vinegar and wild garlic that morning to mask her scent. The conflicting smells muddled Gareth's senses. "Nothing," Gareth grumbled, though his voice was a dangerous, gravelly rasp that sent shivers down Beatrice's spine. "A ghost. Proceed to the war room." When his heavy boots finally faded down the corridor, Beatrice collapsed to her knees, trembling violently. Time was running out. She had to get her boys out of Aylesbury before the king realized the ghost he smelled was entirely real. The winter solstice arrived, bringing with it the grandest event of the kingdom's calendar, the Feast of the Longest Night. It was a mandatory celebration for all high-ranking lords and military commanders, a display of strength and unity in the face of the ongoing rogue threats. The great hall of Castle Aylesbury was transformed into a spectacle of medieval decadence. Massive hearths roared with 6-foot logs, casting dancing shadows against the ancient, moth-eaten tapestries that depicted the kingdom's bloody history. Long oaken tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, spiced wines, and elaborate towers of crystallized fruits. Because the castle was hosting over 300 guests, every able-bodied servant was drafted to work the great hall, including Beatrice. Panic seized her. She could not leave the twins alone in the sprawling, chaotic servant quarters, where drunken guards and unpredictable guests were known to wander. Out of sheer desperation, she smuggled Liam and Leo into the great hall, hiding them in a deep, velvet-draped alcove situated behind the musicians' gallery. "Do not move," she commanded them, her voice cracking with fear as she gripped their small shoulders. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay behind this curtain. I will come for you when the final horn sounds." Liam, the slightly more stoic of the two, nodded solemnly, his golden eyes filled with an understanding far beyond his years. Leo simply clutched his brother's hand. For the first few hours, the feast went exactly as planned. Beatrice kept her head down, pouring wine and clearing trenchers, invisible among the dozens of bustling servants. At the head table, King Gareth sat like a brooding storm cloud, a heavy golden goblet resting loosely in his scarred hand. Lady Rowena Croft sat dangerously close to him, laughing loudly and attempting to draw his attention, though the king's eyes remained hollow and unfocused, constantly scanning the hall as if searching for something he couldn't name. The disaster did not come from the king, but from the hubris of his lords. To entertain the court, Gregory Halloway had arranged a spectacle. The great heavy doors of the hall swung open, and 4 armored guards struggled into the room, dragging a massive iron-wrought cage. Inside paced a captured beast, a monstrous feral direwolf from the rogue packs, captured during the border skirmishes. It was meant to be a display of Aylesbury's dominance over its enemies. The crowd erupted into cheers and jeers, throwing scraps of food at the cage. The noise was deafening. The sheer aggression in the room spiked, a heady mix of ale, testosterone, and lichen bloodlust. Lady Rowena, eager to impress the king with her fearlessness, strutted down from the high table toward the cage. She held a long, silver-tipped riding crop. "See how the mongrel cowers," she announced to the roaring crowd. She struck the iron bars with her crop. The sharp clang echoed through the hall. The feral direwolf snapped. It lunged at the bars, its immense weight slamming into the poorly secured iron grate. The rusted locking mechanism, stressed by the cold and the impact, shattered. The great beast burst from the cage. Screams ripped through the great hall. Lords scrambled backward, overturning tables. Guards drew their broadswords, but in the chaos of hundreds of panicking guests, they could not get a clear shot. The feral wolf, maddened by captivity and noise, snapped its massive jaws, looking for the easiest prey. It completely bypassed Rowena, its predatory eyes locking onto the scent of fear radiating from the back of the hall. It lunged past the musicians' gallery, heading straight for the velvet-draped alcove. Beatrice, who was at the far end of the room near the hearth, saw the beast's trajectory. Her blood ran cold. "No!" she screamed, dropping a silver platter of wine cups. The clatter was lost in the din, but she sprinted across the hall, shoving heavily armored lords out of her way with the desperate strength of a mother. The feral wolf tore down the heavy velvet curtain with one swipe of its massive paw. There stood Liam and Leo, exposed. A normal 5-year-old child would have screamed, cried, or frozen in terror. But these were not normal children. The sudden, lethal threat to their lives, combined with the intense, aggressive energy of the hundreds of adult wolves in the room, triggered an ancient, dormant defense mechanism locked deep within their royal DNA. As the massive direwolf lunged, jaws snapping open to tear into the boys, something impossible happened. A sound echoed through the great hall. A deep, resonant, bone-rattling snarl that did not belong to a child. It did not even belong to a normal wolf. It was the absolute, unquestionable command of an alpha. Right before the eyes of 300 nobles, the twin boys did not cower. Instead, their small bodies convulsed violently. The sound of shifting bones cracked like musket fire over the screaming crowd. It was a premature shift, forced by adrenaline and royal blood, a phenomenon completely unheard of in lichen history before the age of puberty. In a burst of pure, blinding kinetic energy, the two boys exploded into their wolf forms. The crowd fell into a shocked, deathly silence. Even the feral direwolf skidded to a halt, its ears flattening against its skull, suddenly recognizing it had attacked something vastly superior. Standing amidst the shredded velvet and overturned wooden stools were 2 majestic, ferocious wolf pups. Though small in stature, their auras were suffocatingly immense. One pup was midnight black, his fur a mirror image of the fearsome king who ruled them. The other was a brilliant, shimmering silver. They stood shoulder to shoulder, teeth bared, golden and blue eyes glowing with a terrifying primal fury as they snarled at the towering rogue beast. At the head table, King Gareth Lancaster shot to his feet. The heavy oak chair behind him splintered into pieces from the force of his movement. His golden eyes were locked onto the two tiny wolves, the black pup, the silver pup, the overpowering, undeniable scent of his own bloodline filling the great hall. Then Gareth's gaze snapped up, tracking the desperate woman who had just burst through the crowd, dropping to her knees in front of the feral beast to shield the pups with her own fragile body. The dirt and soot had wiped away from her face in her panic. It was Beatrice. The great hall was paralyzed. No one dared to breathe. The Alpha King stepped down from the dais, his eyes burning with a mixture of absolute rage, disbelief, and an overwhelming, devastating recognition. The silence in the great hall was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of the massive hearths and the low guttural growls of the two tiny wolves standing their ground behind their mother. King Gareth Lancaster did not run. He walked. Every step he took down the stone steps of the royal dais seemed to shake the very foundations of Castle Aylesbury. His golden eyes never left Beatrice, who was still kneeling on the stone floor, her arms spread wide to shield the miniature black and silver beasts behind her. The feral rogue direwolf, which just moments ago had been ready to slaughter them, now lay completely flattened against the flagstones. It whined pitifully, completely dominated by the crushing weight of the king's approaching alpha aura. "My king," Lord Gregory Halloway choked out, breaking the silence as he stepped forward, his face pale with a mixture of shock and calculating dread. "The beasts! They are abominations. Pups do not shift before their 12th winter. They are cursed. Let the guards—" Gareth didn't even turn his head. He simply raised a single, scarred hand. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, Commander Cedric Thorne, the king's most loyal enforcer, drew his broadsword and pressed the steel directly against Halloway's throat. The prime advisor swallowed hard, falling dead silent. Gareth reached the center of the hall. He stood towering over the cowering rogue wolf. Without a weapon, without breaking his gaze from Beatrice, Gareth simply pressed his heavy leather boot onto the back of the rogue's neck. There was a sickening crack, and the massive threat was extinguished instantly. He kicked the carcass aside as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. Then, the Alpha King fell to one knee before the healer's apprentice. Beatrice was trembling so violently, her teeth chattered. She kept her head bowed, staring at the scuffed tips of Gareth's boots, waiting for the execution order. She had stolen the royal bloodline. She had denied the king his heirs. In the harsh laws of their kind, her life was forfeit. "Look at me," Gareth commanded. His voice was not a yell, but a low, vibrating rumble that commanded obedience on a cellular level. Slowly, Beatrice lifted her chin. The soot on her face was streaked with silent tears. She met the stormy, furious, heartbroken golden eyes of the man she had never stopped loving. 5 years, Gareth breathed, the words barely audible over the crackling fires, meant only for her. 5 years I tore this kingdom apart looking for a ghost. I burned rogue camps to ash. I scoured the frozen wastelands. I thought you were dead, Beatrice. Before she could form a reply, A sharp nip on her elbow made her flinch. The tiny black wolf, Leo, had pushed past her protective arm. Despite being a fraction of Gareth's size, the pup planted his paws on the stone, bared his needle-sharp teeth, and let out a high-pitched, defiant bark at the Alpha King. He was protecting his mother. Gareth's furious expression shattered. A look of profound, agonizing awe washed over his hardened features. He reached out a trembling, heavily scarred hand. Leo snapped at the king's fingers, but Gareth did not pull back. Instead, he released a slow, soothing wave of his own aura. Pure, unadulterated paternal dominance combined with a profound gentleness. He was answering the pup's challenge, not with violence, but with claiming. The silver pup, Liam, cautiously trotted forward to join his brother. The two tiny wolves sniffed the king's hand. The ancient, undeniable call of their shared bloodline clicked into place. The boy's aggressive posturing melted. Leo let out a soft whimper and bumped his wet nose against Gareth's palm, while Liam circled the king's knee, suddenly exhausted. Forcing a shift at 5 years old was an immense drain on their bodies. Their small legs began to wobble. "They cannot hold this form, Beatrice," Gareth said, his voice thick with emotion, as he scooped both heavy pups into his massive arms. They settled instantly against his chest, their snouts burying into his fur cloak, drawing on his immense heat and strength. "They will burn out." I do not know how to change them back," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking. "It was the terror, the adrenaline. It forced the change." Gareth stood up, cradling his sons. He turned to face the 300 nobles of his court, who were watching with bated breath. The king's aura flared, flooding the great hall with a terrifying, absolute authority. "These are my sons," Gareth's voice boomed, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. "Princes of the House of Lancaster, true-born heirs to the kingdom of Aylesbury. Any man or woman who questions their legitimacy or speaks a word against their mother will lose their tongue and their head. The feast is over. Clear the hall." Pandemonium erupted as the lords and ladies scrambled to obey, desperate to escape the king's wrath. Lady Rowena Croft stood frozen by the high table, her face contorted in a mask of pure, venomous hatred as she stared at Beatrice. Gareth did not wait for the hall to empty. He turned to Commander Cedric. "Guard the perimeter of the royal wing. No one enters, not even the council." "At once, Your Grace," Cedric bowed deeply. Gareth looked down at Beatrice, who was still kneeling on the cold stone. "Get up," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You are coming with me. We have 5 years of treason and lies to discuss." The king's private chambers were a fortress within a fortress, situated in the highest tower of Castle Aylesbury. Heavy tapestries depicting ancient wolf hunts lined the walls, and a massive 4-poster bed, draped in crimson velvet, dominated the room. Gareth gently laid the 2 exhausted wolf pups onto the center of the down mattress. He sat beside them, resting one large hand on each of their backs, continually funneling his alpha energy into their small bodies to stabilize their erratic heart rates. Within moments, the magic of the royal bloodline took effect. The fur receded, bones snapped painlessly back into place, and Liam and Leo lay sleeping soundly in their human forms, completely naked and blissfully unaware of the political earthquake they had just caused. Beatrice stood awkwardly by the heavy oak door, her dirty hands twisting the fabric of her stained scullery apron. She felt entirely out of place in the opulent room, a commoner trapped in the den of the most powerful man in the realm. Gareth pulled a thick fur blanket over the boys, ensuring they were warm, before slowly standing up. He turned to face Beatrice. The tenderness he had shown his sons vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating demeanor of a ruler who had been deeply betrayed. "Start talking," Gareth commanded softly. He began to pace the length of the room like a caged predator. "And do not insult my intelligence with lies, Beatrice. Why did you run?" "To save my life," Beatrice answered, her voice shaking, but her chin held high. "And to save theirs." Gareth stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "From me? You thought I would harm my own mate? My own flesh and blood?" "You were not my mate, Gareth!" Beatrice snapped, the raw fear finally giving way to 5 years of repressed exhaustion and anger. "You were the crown prince. I was a healer's apprentice with dirt under my fingernails. The council had already drafted your betrothal to Princess Eleanor of the Eastern Reaches. Do you know what they do to common women who carry royal bastards? They execute them. They rip the children away to be raised by nobles, and the mother is disposed of. I heard Lord Halloway planning it the night before I fled." Gareth's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. "Halloway knew?" "He suspected," Beatrice corrected, wrapping her arms around herself. "I started getting sick. I knew if I stayed, I would be dead before the first snow fell. So I left. I went to Oakhaven. I changed my name. I hid them in plain sight." Gareth crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them. He loomed over her, his immense frame blocking out the light from the hearth. Beatrice flinched, expecting violence, but instead, Gareth reached out and gently gripped her shoulders. "Look at me," he demanded, his voice thick with a pain that surprised her. "Do you know what happened to Princess Eleanor?" Beatrice frowned, confused by the sudden change in topic. "The court gossip said she died of a sudden fever before the wedding." Gareth let out a dark, bitter laugh. "There was no fever, Beatrice. I broke the betrothal. I told my father and the council that I would rather plunge the kingdom into a bloody civil war than tie my soul to a woman who was not mine. I sent Eleanor back to the east with chests of gold to buy her silence, and we faked her illness to save the council's pride." Beatrice stared at him, the blood draining from her face. You broke a royal treaty? For you," Gareth roared, though he kept his volume low enough not to wake the twins. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as a shudder ran through his massive frame. "I tore the treaty to shreds because I was going to claim you at the Solstice Court. I was going to make you my queen. But when I went to the infirmary to find you, you were gone. The bed was cold. Your scent was fading. You took everything from me." Beatrice's breath hitched. The tragic irony of their situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had fled to escape a marriage that Gareth had already destroyed to be with her. 5 years of poverty, terror, and hiding, all because they had not communicated in the shadows of the court. "I didn't know," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Gareth, I didn't know. I was terrified." His thumbs gently wiped the tear and the soot from her cheek. You are never leaving this castle again, Beatrice. You will sleep in my bed. You will eat at my table. And tomorrow I will assemble the council and officially legitimize my sons. While a tentative, fragile peace settled over the royal chambers, a venomous conspiracy was brewing in the damp, torchlit dungeons below the castle. Lord Gregory Halloway paced the floor of the secret council room, his face twisted in a snarl. Sitting at the heavy stone table was Lady Rowena Croft, swirling a goblet of dark wine, her eyes glittering with malice. "He humiliated me," Halloway spat, rubbing his neck where the commander's sword had pressed. "He claims a peasant whore and 2 freakish runts as the royal line. The noble houses will not stand for this. The noble houses will do whatever the Alpha King commands, Gregory, because they are terrified of him," Rowena said smoothly, taking a sip of her wine. "Gareth's military strength is absolute. If you try to challenge his claim directly, he will mount your head on a spike before breakfast." "Then what do you suggest, my lady? That we curtsy to Queen Scullery Maid?" Halloway mocked. "Certainly not," Rowena smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. "The king cannot be challenged by military force, but he is still bound by the ancient accords, the foundation of Lycan law." Halloway stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing in interest. "Go on." Rowena unrolled a crumbling parchment she had smuggled from the royal archives. "The boys shifted before their time," she explained, tapping a long manicured fingernail against the ancient text. "According to the accords of the first wolves, a premature shift is considered a sign of a corrupted bloodline, a curse upon the land. The ancient accords, decree of purity. Condition: if a royal heir assumes the beast form prior to their 12th winter, their blood is deemed unstable. The mandate: the Council of Elders holds the absolute right to demand the trial of the ancestors. The consequence: should the king refuse the trial, his reign is declared unholy, and the outer territories are legally bound to rebel, stripping his alpha command. Halloway's eyes widened as he read the text. The trial of the ancestors. But that hasn't been invoked in 300 years. It is a death sentence. The children are locked in the haunted catacombs beneath the castle for a full night. They must face the spirits of the violent dead without the protection of their alpha. "Exactly," Rowena smirked. "They are 5 years old, Gregory. Royal blood or not, they are exhausted and terrified. They will never survive the night in the catacombs. The cold alone will kill them, or the madness of the dark will shatter their minds." "And if they die," Halloway deduced, a wicked grin spreading across his face, "the peasant woman loses her leverage. The king is left heirless and broken. He will need a strong, pure-blood queen to stabilize his reign." Rowena raised her goblet in a mock toast. "And I will be right there to comfort our grieving king. Tomorrow at dawn, we present the accords to the public assembly. Gareth will have a choice: surrender his bastard children to the trial, or plunge the entire continent into a holy war he cannot win." The trap was set. Beatrice had survived the bitter cold of exile and the immediate wrath of the king, but she was entirely unprepared for the lethal, ancient politics of the Aylesbury court. The battle for her sons' lives had only just begun. The morning sun over the kingdom of Aylesbury offered no warmth, only a pale, sickly light that filtered through the frost-choked stained glass of the throne room. Word of the impossible event at the solstice feast had spread through the castle like a virulent plague. When King Gareth Lancaster summoned the morning court, the grand hall was packed shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful figures of the realm. Duke William Somerset of the Western Vales stood whispering furiously with Bishop Thomas Redfield, while Lord Harrington, a wealthy baron of the iron mines, watched the royal dais with calculating, hawkish eyes. Gareth sat upon the heavy ironwood throne, his face a mask of lethal calm. Beside him, standing tall despite the trembling in her knees, was Beatrice. She was no longer dressed in the stained rags of a scullery maid. Gareth had ordered her draped in a gown of deep emerald velvet, lined with winter fox fur, marking her undeniable status under his protection. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and Lord Gregory Halloway strode down the central aisle, flanked by Lady Rowena Croft. They did not look like subjects approaching their king. They looked like executioners approaching the block. "Your Grace," Halloway began, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, dripping with false reverence. "The realm rejoices at the discovery of your heirs. However, the nature of their revelation has caused deep unrest among the noble houses. To ensure the stability of your reign, the council has consulted the archives." Halloway unfurled the crumbling yellowed parchment of the ancient accords. The silence in the room sharpened into a blade. "By the decree of the first wolves," Halloway read aloud, his voice booming so every lord could hear, "any royal pup who assumes the beast form prior to their 12th winter possesses an unstable lineage. Such a premature shift is a dangerous corruption. Therefore, the council invokes the mandate of purity. The princes must face the trial of the ancestors before the next moon sets." Gasps erupted across the hall. Duke Somerset stepped forward, his face pale. "Halloway, you speak of madness. That trial has not been invoked in centuries. It is a death sentence for children." Gareth stood up, the sheer force of his alpha aura slamming into the room like a physical blow. Several lesser lords fell to their knees, clutching their chests as the air grew suffocatingly thin. "You dare threaten my sons, Halloway?" Gareth's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that promised immediate, violent death. "I am the Alpha King. I am the law. There will be no trial." Rowena Croft stepped forward, a smug, viperous smile playing on her lips. "If you refuse, Your Grace, you break the oldest covenant of our kind. By law, the outer territories will be forced to rebel against an unholy throne. Aylesbury will burn, thousands of your subjects will die in a civil war. Is the peasant woman's spawn worth the destruction of your entire kingdom?" Gareth's hand dropped to the hilt of his broadsword. He was fully prepared to decapitate Halloway and Rowena right there on the stone floor. Consequences be damned. He would slaughter every lord in the room before he let them touch his children. But before he could draw his blade, a soft, trembling hand covered his. Beatrice stepped in front of the king. Her heart was shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, but the years spent hiding in the ruthless wilderness of Oakhaven had forged her spirit in iron. She knew the politics of men and beasts. If Gareth drew his sword now, her sons would spend the rest of their lives hunted by their own people. "What does the trial entail?" Beatrice asked, her voice ringing clear and steady across the silent hall. Halloway sneered at her, disgusted that a commoner dared to speak. The children are to be sealed within the haunted catacombs beneath the castle for one full night. They must endure the dark, the cold, and the restless spirits of the ancient, feral kings. No food, no light, and absolutely no protection from their parents. If they survive until dawn, their lineage is pure. If they perish, it is the will of the goddess. Gareth grabbed Beatrice's arm, his golden eyes blazing with desperation. "No, I will not allow it. I will burn this castle to the ground first." "Gareth, look at them," Beatrice whispered, turning to look at the murmuring lords. "If you fight this, Holloway wins. The kingdom fractures. We will spend our lives running, and Liam and Leo will never know peace." Suddenly, the heavy doors of the royal antechamber opened. Little footsteps echoed on the stone. Liam and Leo, dressed in fine miniature tunics bearing the Lancaster crest, walked bravely down the aisle. They had been listening. Though they were only 5 years old, their alpha instincts gave them an unnatural, haunting maturity. Liam, the silver-eyed twin, stopped before Holloway. He did not look up at the prime advisor. He looked right through him. "We are not afraid of the dark," Liam said, his high-pitched voice carrying a strange, chilling echo. Leo, the dark-haired brother, looked up at Gareth. "Let us go, father. We will show them." Gareth fell to his knees, pulling his sons into a crushing embrace. The great Alpha King, the most feared warrior in the north, wept openly in front of his court. He pressed his forehead against theirs, his heart breaking under the weight of the crown. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the jagged mountains, a grim procession made its way to the deepest, oldest bowels of the castle. The air grew freezing, smelling of ancient dust, damp earth, and decaying bones. Heavy iron doors, inscribed with ancient runic wards, stood before them. Beatrice knelt in the dirt before her boys. She did not cry. She could not afford to show them fear. She gripped their small shoulders, looking fiercely into their eyes. "Remember the woods in Oakhaven," she whispered fiercely, tracing the lines of their faces. "Remember the winter storms. You are wolves. You are the kings of the forest. The dark does not hunt you, my darlings. You hunt in the dark. Stay together. Share your heat." The guards pushed the heavy iron doors open. A blast of freezing, stagnant air rushed out, carrying the faint, terrifying sound of phantom whispers. Without a word, Liam and Leo walked hand in hand into the pitch-black abyss. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind them with a dreadful finality, and the heavy crossbar was dropped into place. The trial had begun. Inside the catacombs, the darkness was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy blackness that pressed against the skin. The air was frigid enough to numb the fingers within minutes. To a human child, it would have been a descent into absolute madness. But Liam and Leo were not human. As soon as the doors locked, the twins closed their eyes and let their lichen senses take over. Their irises dilated, glowing faintly in the dark. One pair a brilliant gold, the other an icy, piercing blue. The labyrinth of bones and stone tombs came into sharp, grayscale focus. "It smells like old rust," Leo whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Keep close," Liam commanded softly. They navigated the twisting corridors, seeking a small, defensible alcove. They found a hollowed-out crypt belonging to a long-dead queen and huddled together inside it, drawing their knees to their chests to conserve body heat. But Lord Holloway had no intention of leaving their survival to chance. Relying on the cold was too risky. He had ensured the catacombs were entirely lethal. An hour past midnight, a grating sound echoed through the lower tunnels. A secret, rusted grate on the far side of the catacombs had been hoisted open from the outside. The twins' ears twitched. They heard the heavy, padding footsteps of something massive, followed by the wet sound of frantic panting. Halloway's men had starved 3 rogue feral hounds, massive beasts used for hunting bears, and released them into the tunnels. Crazed with hunger, the hounds caught the scent of the 2 small children immediately. Above ground, the castle was a powder keg. Gareth had not returned to his chambers. He stood in the war room, his hands gripping the edges of the heavy oak table so hard the wood was splintering under his fingers. Beatrice sat nearby, staring blankly into the hearth, silently praying to the moon goddess. Suddenly, the doors burst open. Commander Cedric dragged a bleeding, terrified castle guard into the room and threw him onto the floor. "Speak!" Cedric barked, kicking the guard in the ribs. "Mercy, your grace!" the guard sobbed, spitting blood onto the stone. "Lord Halloway paid us. We opened the lower sluice gate to the catacombs. They dropped 3 war hounds inside. They're starving, sire. The boys are already dead." The sound that tore from Gareth's throat was not human. It was the roar of a primordial beast. The king did not issue orders. He did not summon the council. He simply ripped his broadsword from its scabbard and sprinted from the room, moving with such explosive speed that the torches flickered and died in his wake. Beatrice was immediately on his heels, her heart screaming in her chest. Down in the pitch-black depths of the crypts, the 3 starving warhounds cornered their prey. The beasts drooled, their ribs showing through patchy fur as they snarled, inching toward the crypt where the 2 boys huddled. A normal child would have screamed. Instead, Liam and Leo stood up. They did not shift into wolves. They did not have the energy left. But as the lead hound lunged forward, jaws snapping to tear Liam's throat out, the 5-year-old boy stepped forward, his eyes blazing like miniature suns in the dark. He opened his mouth and unleashed a sound that defied logic. It was a localized, concentrated burst of pure alpha dominance, a shockwave of royal authority that reverberated off the stone walls, carrying the ancient, heavy weight of the Lancaster lineage. The lead hound, mid-leap, yelped as if it had been struck by a physical hammer. It crashed onto the stone floor, scrambling backward. Leo stepped beside his brother, his blue eyes flashing. He let out a low, vibrating growl, baring his small human teeth. The sheer, unadulterated power of their combined bloodline flooded the narrow tunnel. It wasn't just intimidation. It was a biological override. The hounds, despite their starving madness, recognized the apex predators of their world. Whimpering, the 3 massive beasts dropped to their bellies, crawling forward in complete, terrified submission. They pressed their massive, heavy heads against the cold stone at the boys' feet. Liam reached out his small, trembling hand and rested it on the lead hound's snout. "Good dog," he whispered, exhaustion finally taking hold. Hours bled into dawn. In the royal courtyard, the entire court had gathered before the heavy iron doors of the catacombs. Lord Halloway stood at the front, attempting to look mournful, while Lady Rowena stood beside him, struggling to hide a triumphant smirk. King Gareth arrived, covered in the blood of Halloway's guards, his face a terrifying mask of grief and wrath. Beatrice stood beside him, clutching his arm, refusing to look away from the doors. "The sun has risen, Your Grace," Holloway said, bowing his head in mock sorrow. "It is time to collect the remains. I am deeply sorry that the lineage proved impure." Gareth didn't speak. He stepped forward, grabbed the massive iron crossbar, and hurled it across the courtyard with a deafening crash. He threw his weight against the doors, shoving them open. Thick, freezing fog rolled out of the ancient tomb, spilling over the cobblestones. The lords and ladies held their breath, straining to see into the blackness. From the shadows, a massive, terrifying shape emerged. The lords gasped, several drawing their weapons as a giant, scarred warhound stepped into the morning light. Then, another hound stepped forward, and a third. Sitting atop the back of the largest beast was Liam. Walking proudly beside him, one hand resting on a hound's heavy collar, was Leo. They were covered in dust, shivering violently from the cold, but they were utterly, completely unharmed. The three vicious warhounds, beasts known to tear fully grown men apart, whined softly and sat dutifully at the boys' sides, guarding them. The courtyard erupted into absolute chaos. Lords fell to their knees in awe. Duke Somerset wept, making the sign of the goddess. The miracle was undeniable. To survive the cold was one thing. To bend feral beasts to their will without shifting was a display of alpha power not seen since the first kings of old. Their lineage was not just pure, it was legendary. Holloway's face turned the color of spoiled milk. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing in shock. Lady Rowena turned on her heel to flee into the castle, but Commander Cedric's massive hand clamped down on her shoulder, holding her in place. Beatrice broke past the guards, dropping to her knees on the cobblestones. The boys slid off the hounds and ran into her arms. She buried her face in their dusty hair, sobbing violently, surrounded by the giant, protective beasts. Gareth walked slowly toward Lord Holloway. The Prime Advisor fell to his knees, raising his hands in frantic supplication. "My king, sire, please, the hounds. It was a test, a necessary test to prove their worth to the realm." Holloway babbled, tears of terror streaming down his face. Gareth looked down at the man who had tormented his mate, who had forced his children into the dark, and who had dared to challenge the Lancaster throne. "The trial has proven their purity," Gareth said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the courtyard. He drew his broadsword, the steel singing in the morning air. "And it has proven your treason." With one smooth, devastating arc, the king silenced the Prime Advisor forever. Holloway's head rolled across the cobblestones, coming to a stop near Lady Rowena's boots. Rowena screamed, dropping to her knees. "Mercy! I was manipulated! I knew nothing of his treachery." Gareth didn't even look at her as he cleaned his blade on Holloway's fallen cloak. "Strip Lady Croft of all titles and lands. Throw her in the dungeon. Let her see if she can survive a night in the catacombs." The guards dragged the screaming noblewoman away. The threat was eradicated. The rot that had infected the court of Aylesbury was finally cut out. Gareth sheathed his sword and walked over to his family. He knelt in the dirt, wrapping his massive arms around Beatrice, Liam, and Leo, pulling them tightly against his chest. The entire court of nobles, witnessing the unquestionable dominance and love of their king, bowed low in absolute loyalty. 3 days later, the bells of Aylesbury rang out across the frozen valleys. The grand cathedral was bathed in golden light. Beatrice stood before the high altar, wearing a magnificent gown of ivory and gold, a heavy diamond diadem resting in her dark hair. She was no longer a frightened healer's apprentice running from shadows. She was the Queen of the North, the anchor to the Alpha King, and the mother of the two most powerful heirs the kingdom had ever seen. Gareth took her hands in his golden eyes radiating a profound, unbreakable devotion. As the bishop placed the crown upon her head, the crowd erupted into cheers. Standing at the front of the dais, dressed in royal regalia, Liam and Leo watched proudly. The winter storms would continue to howl outside the castle walls, and the medieval world would always be fraught with danger. But inside the heart of Aylesbury, the pack was whole, the lineage was secure, and the hidden pups had finally claimed their rightful throne. The epic journey of Beatrice and her twin alpha pups proves that a mother's fierce love and undeniable destiny can conquer even the darkest royal betrayals. If this medieval werewolf saga had your heart racing and you loved seeing the king finally reunite with his true mate and heirs, you know what to do. Hit that like button to support the Lancaster pack. Share this story with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic, and emotionally explosive werewolf stories every single week. Don't miss out.